They say the past is a shadow you can never outrun, no matter how high you climb. Alara Vance had survived the brutal winter, the wolves, and the rejection of the husband who sentenced her to die. She had found a new life in the arms of Elias Thorne, a man who spoke in silence and loved with the fierceness of the wild. They thought the hidden valley was a fortress that the world couldn't touch. But they were wrong. Peace in the high country is as fragile as thin ice on a spring thaw. Just when the scars of the past began to fade, a new threat emerged from the tree line, not a stranger, but a ghost carrying a secret that would shatter their sanctuary. This time, survival isn't about fighting the cold. It's about fighting for a miracle the town of Bitter Creek said was impossible. When the dust settles, only one truth will remain. Nothing is more dangerous than a mother protecting what she was told she could never have. Welcome back to Frontier Rescue Stories. If you love tales of redemption, rugged justice, and romance that blooms against all odds, you have come to the right place. Before we dive into Journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video, and smash subscribe. Your support helps us stir up the algorithm and bring these campfire tales to a larger audience. Also, I love hearing from you. So drop a comment down below and let me know which part of the world you are tuning in from today. Do you think Caleb Sterling, the man who cast her out, deserves a second chance? Or should he rot in the bed he made? Drop your answer in the comments below. Now tighten your saddle girths. Let's head back into the wild. The seasons in the high country don't ask for permission to change. They simply demand that you adapt or die. 6 months had passed since Mrs. Sterling and her posse of hired guns had turned their tails and fled our valley, leaving the silence of the mountains to settle back over us like a warm, heavy quilt. Summer had been a blessing of wild berries, fat trout in the stream, and days so long the sun seemed reluctant to dip behind the granite peaks. For Alara and Elias, it was a time of healing, a time where the jagged edges of their past lives were slowly smoothed down by the rhythm of their new existence. They had built a life that was simple, brutal, and honest. Alara, the woman once cast out of a mansion in Bitter Creek for being hollow and useless, had become as much a part of the landscape as the pine trees. She moved with a quiet confidence now, her hands rough from work but steady. She had learned to read the wind, to cure hides, and to listen to the unspoken language of the forest. The fox kit, Ember, now a sleek young adult with a coat like burnished copper, shadowed her every step, a living testament to the nurturing spirit Alara had been told she didn't possess. But as the aspen leaves began to turn a trembling gold, signaling the approach of another unforgiving winter, a new fear began to take root in Alara's heart. It wasn't the fear of cold or hunger. She had conquered those ghosts already. It was a fear that came from within. It started with a dizziness that hit her in the mornings, a wave of nausea that sent the world spinning while she tried to stoke the fire. At first she hid it from Elias. She saw the way he watched her, his eyes sharp and assessing, always scanning for danger. She didn't want him to worry that the woman he had saved was weak. But more than that, she was terrified of what the sickness might mean. In the silence of her own mind, the old voices from Bitter Creek crept back in. Cursed, Caleb had said, a hollow place where life should grow. One afternoon, while gathering late-season roots near the stream, the nausea brought her to her knees. The world tilted and she retched into the moss, her body shaking violently. She sat back on her heels, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, waiting for the spell to pass. But as her hand rested on her stomach, a sudden, lightning-strike realization hit her. It was a thought so impossible, so forbidden by the narrative of her life, that she barely dared to think it. She wasn't sick. She wasn't dying. She was full. Tears, hot and fast, spilled down her cheeks. For 7 years, she had prayed for this in a feather bed, only to be met with silence. Now in a cave at the edge of the world, with nothing but love and survival to her name. The impossible had happened, but along with the joy came a crushing wave of terror. How could she tell Elias? He was a man who had already buried a wife and a daughter. He had closed off that part of his heart, sealing it behind a wall of stone to survive the grief. Would this news break him? Would he look at her with fear, knowing the dangers of bringing a child into this savage wilderness? That evening, the air in the cave was thick with unspoken words. Elias sat by the fire, sharpening his skinning knife with rhythmic, rasping strokes. He paused, looking up at her across the flames. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't have to. He knew the cadence of her breathing, the tension in her shoulders. The wind is changing, he said, his voice a low rumble. Winter is coming early. Alara looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She couldn't keep it a secret. In this valley, truth was the only currency that mattered. It's not just the wind, Elias, she whispered, her voice trembling. He set the knife down, giving her his full, intense attention. Are you in pain? No, she said, shaking her head. I don't know how to say this. For years I was told I was broken. I was thrown away because I couldn't give a life. She took a deep, shuddering breath. But the mountains, they don't care about what people say. She placed her hand over her stomach, the gesture unmistakable. Elias went still, absolute statue stillness. The firelight danced in his eyes, reflecting a storm of emotions, shock, disbelief, and then, slowly, a dawn of wonder that looked painful in its intensity. He stood up and crossed the small space between them. He didn't speak. He knelt before her, his large, calloused hand hovering over hers, afraid to touch, afraid to shatter the moment. When he finally covered her hand with his palm was warm, grounding. A life? He asked, his voice cracking, the gravel gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. A life, she confirmed, weeping now. We're going to have a family, Elias. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a decade. The man who had walked alone, the man who had promised only survival, buried his face in her lap. His shoulders shook, and for the second time since she had known him, she saw the cracks in the stone. But this wasn't grief. It was the terrifying, overwhelming weight of hope. They stayed like that for a long time. The fire crackling, the world outside forgotten. They made promises in the dark, promises to protect, to build, to fight the winter with a ferocity they had never known before. They thought the biggest challenge ahead of them was the snow. But the wilderness has eyes, and the past has a long memory. 2 days later, the peace was shattered not by a storm, but by the sound of a horse whinnying at the entrance of the valley. It wasn't the heavy stomping gait of a war horse or a posse. It was a single rider. Elias was at the cave mouth in a heartbeat, his rifle in hand, his face hardening back into the mask of the predator. Alara stood behind him, a hand on her stomach, her other hand gripping the handle of her skinning knife. A lone figure rode into the clearing. He was slumped in the saddle, wrapped in a dusty coat that had seen better days. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a dead man riding. As he drew closer, he raised empty hands. Don't shoot, the man croaked, his voice dry as parchment. I am not here to fight. I'm here because a dying man paid me my weight in gold to find the woman called Alara. Alara stepped forward, her blood turning to ice. She recognized the horse. It bore the brand of the Sterling Ranch. Who sent you? She demanded, though she already knew the answer. The rider slid off his horse, stumbling with exhaustion. He looked at Alara, his eyes widening as he took in her appearance. The furs, the strength, the wildness. Caleb Sterling? The man wheezed. He's sick, ma'am. The doctors say it's a rot in his blood. He knows he's dying, and he says he has something that belongs to you, something he hid for 7 years. He said to tell you, the nursery wasn't always silent. The words hung in the crisp mountain air, heavy and suffocating, instantly sucking the warmth out of the autumn afternoon. The nursery wasn't always silent. Alara stared at the rider, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence that made her knees weak. For 7 years, the silence of that nursery had been her prison. It was the evidence of her failure, the reason for her exile, the weapon Caleb had used to flay her spirit before casting her into the snow. To hear now that it might have been a lie, a deception orchestrated by the very man who had condemned her, was a shock so profound it felt like a physical blow. Elias moved before she could speak. He crossed the distance to the rider in 2 long, terrifying strides, grabbing the man's coat and hauling him halfway off the saddle. The rider yelped, his hands flying up in surrender. You come here with riddles from a dead man? Elias growled, his voice a low rumble of thunder. She has no business with that poison place. Turn your horse, or I will bury you where you stand. Elias, stop! Alara's voice cracked like a whip. She stepped forward, her hand still protective over her stomach, where her new secret lay hidden. She wasn't the trembling girl who had left Bitter Creek. She was a woman forged in the fires of survival, and her eyes burned with a demand for truth. She signaled for Elias to release the man. Reluctantly, the mountain man let go, though he didn't sheath his knife. He stepped back to Alara's side, a silent, bristling wall of defense. Explain yourself, Alara commanded, her gaze locking onto the messenger. Caleb cast me out because I gave him no air. The whole town saw it. What game is he playing now? The rider rubbed his neck, looking nervously at the massive man beside her and the copper-furred fox watching from the cave mouth. It isn't a game, ma'am. It's a confession. Caleb. He's rotting from the inside out. The fever took his strength, but the guilt is taking his mind. He talks about a night 5 years ago. A night you were sick with the sleeping draughts his mother gave you. He says the midwife didn't leave empty-handed. The world tilted on its axis. Alara grabbed Elias's arm to steady herself. Memories, fragmented and hazy, clawed at the back of her mind. Bouts of illness she had blamed on her own weakness. Days lost to a drugged slumber she had been told was for her nerves. Could it be? Could they have been so cruel, so monstrous, as to steal a life from her and tell her it never existed? And if they had, where was the child? I have to go, Alara whispered. It wasn't a question. Elias turned to her, his face etched with a desperate worry. Alara, no, it's a trap. They want to hurt you. They want to drag you back into their cage. You have a life here. We have a future. His eyes darted momentarily to her stomach, a silent plea to protect the child they hadn't even met yet. I know, she said, her voice breaking. She reached up, cupping his rough, bearded cheek. But if there is a child, if my baby is out there somewhere, thinking I abandoned them, I cannot live in this peace, Elias. I will never be free of him until I know the truth. Elias looked at her, searching for the fear he used to see, but he found only a mother's ferocious resolve. He let out a long, resigned sigh, the sound of a man accepting a war he didn't start, but would damn well finish. Then we ride, he said. But we ride on my terms. And if anyone in that town so much as looks at you wrong, I will burn it to the ground. The journey back to Bitter Creek was a descent into the past, but the woman making the descent had changed. Alara rode the horse the messenger had brought. He was forced to walk, while Elias moved alongside them on foot, his stamina inexhaustible. As the jagged peaks gave way to rolling foothills and finally the flat, dusty plains of the territory, Alara felt the tightening in her chest. Every mile was a step closer to the site of her execution. They reached the outskirts of Bitter Creek 3 days later, just as the sun was bleeding a bruised crimson over the horizon. The town looked exactly the same. The weathered boardwalks, the church steeple that cast a long shadow of judgment, the saloon with its tinny piano music drifting into the street. But as they entered the main thoroughfare, the town felt small. It felt insignificant compared to the majesty of the high country. Their arrival stopped the town cold. Alara Vance, the woman who had been thrown to the wolves, was riding down Main Street. She wore a coat of timber wolf fur, her hair braided with leather and beads in the manner of the mountain tribes. She sat tall, her face bronzed by the wind and sun, radiating a power that made the townspeople step back. And beside her walked a giant of a man, a legend of the peaks, with a tomahawk on his belt and eyes that dared anyone to speak. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Is that her? It's a ghost. Look at her. She looks wild. They didn't look at her with pity anymore. They looked at her with fear. Alara stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the people who had shunned her. Her destination was the large white house on the hill, the Sterling mansion. The iron gates were rusted, the garden overgrown. The house itself seemed to be dying along with its master, the paint peeling and the windows dark and staring like empty sockets. They dismounted at the front steps. The messenger, terrified of being seen with them, scurried away into the shadows. Elias stepped onto the porch first, kicking the front door open with a crash that echoed through the hollow house. The foyer smelled of sickness, stale air, medicine, and decay. It was a sharp contrast to the smell of pine and wood smoke that Alara now called home. Footsteps hurried down the grand staircase. What is the meaning of this intrusion? It was Mrs. Sterling. But she was not the imperious matriarch who had commanded the armed men at the valley entrance. She looked shrunken, her face gray and lined, her black dress hanging loosely on a frame consumed by stress. When she saw Alara, the color drained from her face completely. She grabbed the banister, swaying.
You!
she hissed, though the venom was weak.
I told you to stay dead.
And I told you I was alive, Alara said, her voice echoing in the grand hall. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Get out of my way, old woman. I'm here for the truth. You will not go up there, Mrs. Sterling shrieked, blocking the stairs with her frail body. He is delirious. He doesn't know what he's saying. You will not disturb his final piece. Elias stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He didn't touch her. He simply loomed over her, a shadow of inevitable judgment. There is no peace in this house, he grated out. Move. Terrified, Mrs. Sterling shrank back against the wall, clutching her chest. Alara swept past her, her boots thudding heavily on the stairs she had once walked softly upon as a dutiful wife. She reached the landing and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. The door was ajar. She pushed it open. The room was sweltering, the fire in the hearth blazing too hot. In the center of the massive four-poster bed lay Caleb Sterling. He was a skeleton wrapped in skin, his eyes sunken into dark pits, his breathing a wet, rattling struggle. He looked nothing like the granite-jawed man who had stood by the fireplace and nodded to seal her fate. At the sound of the door, Caleb's head lolled to the side. His fever-bright eyes struggled to focus, and then they landed on Alara. A wheezing gasp escaped his cracked lips. He tried to lift a hand that trembled violently. "Alara?" he croaked, the sound barely human. Is it the angel? Or the devil come for me?" Alara walked to the side of the bed. She didn't take his hand. She stood over him, looking down with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "I am neither, Caleb," she said coldly. "I am the wife you threw away, and I am here to ask you one question before you meet your maker." She leaned in close, so close she could smell the rot on his breath. "Where is the child?" Caleb's eyes widened, filling with tears that tracked through the grime on his face. He let out a sob that racked his wasted frame. I didn't want," Mother said. He coughed, spitting blood. "She said you were too weak, that the boy, he needed a strong line. We gave him away, Alara. We gave him away the night he was born." The confirmation hit her with the force of a landslide. A son. She had a son. "Where?" Alara demanded, grabbing the collar of his nightshirt. "Where is he?" Caleb's eyes rolled back for a moment before focusing one last time. Not away. Close. So close. The orphanage, at the edge of town. St. Jude's. He has your eyes, Alara. He has your eyes." Caleb slumped back, his energy spent, his chest heaving. But Alara was no longer looking at him. She was looking at Elias, who stood in the doorway, his face a mask of thunderous rage. "He's here," Alara whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying hope. "My son is in this town." But before they could move, a cold, metallic click sounded from the hallway behind Elias. "He was in this town." Mrs. Sterling's voice came from the shadows, steady and cruel. "But you will never see him." The hallway of the Sterling mansion exploded into chaos with the deafening roar of a gunshot. The muzzle flash from the heavy Colt dragoon in Mrs. Sterling's shaking hand lit up the gloom like a lightning strike, the smell of sulfur instantly choking the air. Time seemed to slow down for Alara. She didn't feel the bullet, but she heard the sickening wet thud of lead hitting flesh. It wasn't her flesh. Elias had moved with the speed of a striking viper, throwing his massive frame in front of Alara just as the trigger clicked. The bullet, meant for Alara's heart, tore through the fleshy part of Elias's upper left arm, the same arm that had been mauled by the mountain lion the winter before. He grunted, a low guttural sound of pain, but his momentum didn't stop. He crashed into Mrs. Sterling, knocking the heavy pistol from her grip and pinning her against the floral wallpaper of the hallway. "Elias!" Alara screamed, rushing to his side. Blood was already soaking through his coat, dark and alarming against the fur. "I'm fine," he rasped, though his face had gone pale beneath his beard. He looked down at the woman pinned beneath his hand. Mrs. Sterling wasn't struggling. She was laughing, a high, brittle sound that bordered on madness. "You can't have him," she cackled, her eyes wide and staring. "He was weak. A crying, sniveling thing just like his mother. I cleansed this house of your failure, Alara. I sent him to the orphanage to be toughened up, but even they couldn't break the softness out of him. So I sent him somewhere that would. Alara grabbed Mrs. Sterling's face, forcing the older woman to look at her. The fear that had once paralyzed Alara in this house was gone, replaced by a mother's primal fury. "Where is my son?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Tell me, or I will let the mountain man finish what the fever started." Mrs. Sterling sneered, spitting at Alara's boots. "St. Jude's had no use for a runt. They sold his contract 3 days ago. He's gone, Alara, swallowed by the earth." Elias tightened his grip, his patience snapping. "The location," he growled. "The iron rail mining camp," she gasped out, the air squeezed from her lungs. "They needed small hands to set the charges in the deep tunnels. He's probably buried under a ton of rock by now." Alara recoiled as if slapped. The iron rail. It was a death sentence, a brutal, lawless operation in the Badlands where grown men died daily, let alone a 5-year-old boy. She looked at Elias. He was bleeding, his old wound reopened, a fresh bullet hole in his shoulder. But he nodded, his eyes hard. "We go." Alara looked back at Mrs. Sterling, who was slumped on the floor, gasping for air. The old Alara might have begged for mercy or sought revenge, but the woman who had survived the winter knew that some fates were worse than death. "I won't kill you," Alara said, standing tall. "I'm going to save my son, and you. You're going to die alone in this rotting house, with no legacy and no name. That is your judgment." They left her there, wailing in the dark hallway, and ran out into the night. The ride to the Badlands was a nightmare of endurance. A storm had rolled in off the plains, turning the world into a slurry of freezing mud and sleet. They had no time to rest, no time to tend to Elias's wound properly. Alara bound his arm tight with strips torn from her skirt, stemming the flow of blood, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. The fever was trying to return, clawing at the edges of his strength. "We can stop," she shouted over the howling wind, seeing him sway in the saddle. "No stopping," Elias shouted back, his teeth gritted against the pain. "Small hands, set charges, we have no time." His words chilled her more than the rain. Every minute they wasted was a minute her son spent in the dark, surrounded by explosives and men with no souls. They reached the perimeter of the iron rail mining camp just before dawn. It was a scar upon the land, a vast, ugly pit dug into the side of a canyon. Smoke from the smelters choked the sky, and the sound of metal on stone rang out like a funeral toll. Tents and shacks were scattered haphazardly around the mine entrance, guarded by men with shotguns and bad intentions. They tethered the horses in a ravine a mile out. Elias checked his rifle, his movements stiff but precise. He handed Alara a small, heavy revolver he had taken from a dead outlaw years ago. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "We find the foreman, we get the boy, we leave." "I'm not staying behind you," Alara said, checking the cylinder of the gun. "That's my blood down there." Elias looked at her, seeing the fierce, unyielding spirit he had helped forge in the wilderness. He nodded once. "Then stay low." They moved like ghosts through the pre-dawn mist. The camp was waking up. Tired, soot-covered men were stumbling out of tents, coughing up black dust. Alara scanned every face, looking for a child, but saw only hardened laborers. They found the foreman's shack near the mine entrance. It was the only building with a chimney and a guarded door. Elias didn't bother with stealth. He walked out of the shadows, a towering figure of vengeance, wet fur and blood. The guard on the porch barely had time to raise his rifle before Elias struck him with the butt of his own weapon, sending him crumbling to the mud without a sound. Elias kicked the door open. Inside, a thick-set man was eating a breakfast of beans and whiskey. He looked up, reaching for the shotgun on the table, but found the cold muzzle of Alara's revolver pressed against his temple. "Don't," Alara warned, her finger tightening on the trigger. The foreman froze, a piece of bacon falling from his mouth. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the mother of the boy you bought from St. Jude's," Alara said, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "Where is he?" The foreman's eyes darted between Alara and the bleeding giant blocking the door. He swallowed hard. "The kid? We got a lot of kids, lady. You gotta be more specific." 5 years old, Elias rumbled, stepping forward. "New arrival, small. A cruel realization dawned on the foreman's face. He let out a dark chuckle. Oh, the mute one. The one who wouldn't stop crying for his mama. "Where is he?" Alara screamed, pressing the gun harder. "You're too late," the foreman sneered. "Shift started an hour ago. He's down in shaft 4. We needed someone to crawl into a collapsed vein to set the dynamite. It's a one-way trip, sweetheart. Fuse is already lit." The world stopped. Shaft 4, dynamite. Alara didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She pistol-whipped the foreman, knocking him unconscious, and turned to the door. "Elias!" she cried. But the warning came too late. A low, ominous rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. Deep in the earth, something roared. A plume of dust and smoke erupted from the mine entrance 100 yards away. The explosion had happened. Alara fell to her knees in the mud, a scream tearing from her throat that was lost in the chaotic shouting of the miners. "No!" she wailed, clawing at the dirt. "No, no, no!" Elias grabbed her, pulling her to her feet. "It's not over!" he roared over the confusion. "The shaft might hold. Run!" They sprinted toward the mine entrance, plunging into the cloud of dust, running straight into the mouth of hell to find a ghost or a corpse of the son Alara had just found. The mouth of the mine was a gaping maw exhaling death. A thick, choking cloud of yellow dust and black smoke billowed out, blinding the miners who scrambled toward the light, coughing and retching. Alara and Elias were the only ones running against the tide. They were salmon swimming upstream in a river of panic, pushing past soot-covered men who grabbed at their clothes, screaming that the whole mountain was coming down. "Get back, she's going to blow again!" a miner shouted, his face a mask of terror. Elias shoved him aside with his good arm, his strength terrifying even in his wounded state. "Move!" he snarled, dragging Alara into the darkness. Inside, the world was instantly stripped of color. The air was hot and tasted of copper and sulfur. The only light came from the flickering lantern of a fallen miner and the distant, ominous glow of secondary fires deep in the belly of the earth. The roar of the explosion had settled into a groaning, creaking protest as the timbers holding up the roof began to splinter under the weight of the mountain. "Which way?" Alara screamed, the sound swallowed by the oppressive dark. She was flying blind, guided only by the desperate magnetic pull of a mother toward her child. Elias stopped, closing his eyes for a second, ignoring the chaos around them. He wasn't listening to the shouting men. He was listening to the earth. He heard the deep groan of shifting rock to the left, the hiss of gas to the right. "Down," he pointed toward a steep, narrow drift that angled sharply into the dark. "Shaft 4, it's the deepest vein." They descended into the throat of the mine. The heat rose with every step, sweat mixing with the grit on their faces. Elias was moving slower now, his breathing ragged. The bandage on his arm was soaked through, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Every step was a battle against gravity and blood loss, but he didn't falter. He was the mountain man, and mountains do not yield. They reached the level of shaft 4. It was a scene of devastation. The ceiling had come down in a jagged curtain of rock and timber, sealing the tunnel off completely. A thick haze of dust hung in the air, motionless and silent. "No," Alara whispered, the words scraping out of her throat. She threw herself at the wall of rubble, tearing at jagged rocks with her bare hands. "He's in there. He has to be in there." She clawed at the stone until her fingernails broke and her hands bled, sobbing his name. "Leo! Leo!" She didn't know his name, she realized with a fresh stab of pain. She was calling out to a ghost. "Baby, answer me!" "Alara, stop!" Elias said, grabbing her wrists. His voice was calm, but his eyes were frantic. "Listen." He pressed his ear against a gap in the fallen timbers. Alara froze, holding her breath until her lungs burned. At first, there was only the dripping of water and the creaking of wood. But then, faint and rhythmic, came a sound. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the random settling of stone. It was deliberate, metal on rock. "He's alive," Elias breathed. He didn't waste another second. He grabbed a discarded pickaxe with his good hand, wedging it into the debris. "Here, the stress point is high. If we move these frantic, we can make a hole. But we have to be fast. The roof is sagging." They worked with the desperation of the damned. Alara hauled rocks that should have been too heavy for her, fueled by adrenaline. Elias levered massive beams, his face turning gray with pain as his wound screamed in protest. Every time he exerted force, fresh blood pumped from his shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and kept working. Finally, a gap appeared, a small dark hole leading into a pocket of air behind the collapse. "Boy!" Elias bellowed into the darkness. "Crawl to the light!" Silence, then a shuffling sound. A small face appeared in the gap, illuminated by the dying light of the lantern Alara held. He was tiny, covered in coal dust, his eyes wide and terrified white orbs in the darkness. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He just stared at them, trembling like a trapped rabbit.
It's him,
Alara sobbed, dropping to her knees.
It's him. Come here, baby. Come to Mama.
The boy hesitated. He had known only cruelty from adults, but then he looked at Alara's eyes that mirrored his own. He saw the tears, the raw, open love, and he made his choice. He wiggled through the jagged opening, scraping his skin, and fell into Alara's arms. She crushed him to her chest, burying her face in his soot-matted hair. He was thin, so terribly thin, his ribs feeling like a bird's cage under his rough shirt. But his heart was beating against hers, a frantic, strong rhythm that matched her own.
I have you, she wept. I have you. I will never let you go.
We have to move, Elias shouted, looking up. The ceiling above them gave a sickening lurch, dust raining down in sheets. The supports are snapping. They turned to run, but the tunnel behind them was shifting. A massive timber beam, dislodged by the aftershocks, crashed down, blocking their path. It wasn't a total seal, but it was too low to crawl under without lifting it, and too heavy for a normal man. They were trapped. Take the boy, Elias commanded. He dropped the pickaxe and stepped up to the beam. Elias, you can't, Alara screamed. Your arm! Go, he roared, a sound that shook the very walls. He wedged his shoulder, his bad shoulder, under the timber. With a primal scream of agony that tore through the mine, he pushed upward. His legs shook, his veins bulged, and the wound in his shoulder tore open completely, blood pouring down his arm. But the beam moved. Inch by agonizing inch, he lifted the weight of the mountain. Crawl, he gasped, sweat and blood blinding him. Alara didn't argue. She knew that to hesitate was to kill them all. She shoved the boy underneath Elias's straining body. The boy scrambled through. Alara followed, looking up at Elias's face as she passed. It was a mask of pure torture, his eyes rolled back, his teeth bared. Elias, let go, she screamed once she was clear, grabbing the boy and pulling him back. Elias dropped the beam. It crashed down with a force that shook the floor, sealing the path behind them mere inches from his heels as he threw himself forward. He landed hard in the dirt, gasping, unable to rise. Get up, Alara cried, dragging him by his coat. We're almost there, I can see the light. The entrance was 50 yards away, a square of gray morning light that looked like heaven. But the mine was done waiting. A deep, thundering roar started from the depths, louder than anything before. The main collapse had begun. The floor rippled like water. Alara grabbed the boy with one hand and Elias with the other. On your feet, mountain man. You promised. You promised you wouldn't leave me. Elias groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at the woman who had once been too weak to survive the winter, now dragging 2 lives toward the light. He found a reserve of strength that came not from muscle but from spirit. He stumbled to his feet. Together, the mother, the son, and the protector ran. The wind of the collapse pushed at their backs, a physical force trying to blow them out like a candle. They burst out of the mine entrance, diving into the mud just as the earth behind them slammed shut. A massive cloud of dust exploded outward, rolling over them, burying them in darkness one last time. Silence returned to the valley, broken only by the settling of rocks. Slowly the dust began to clear. Alara pushed herself up, coughing. She frantically checked the bundle in her arms. The boy was shaken, crying silently now, tears making tracks in the coal dust, but he was whole. She looked around wildly. Elias? A few feet away, a mound of gray dust stirred. Elias sat up. He looked like a statue rising from the grave. He looked at Alara, then at the boy. He tried to smile, but his eyes lost focus. He swayed, and then, like a great tree finally felled by the axe, he collapsed backward into the mud, his chest still. Elias! Alara screamed, scrambling toward him, her hands pressing onto a chest that was terrifyingly silent. Panic is a cold thing, but love is a fire that refuses to be smothered. Alara fell upon Elias's chest, her hands slick with mud and blood, pressing down on the ragged hole in his shoulder with all her weight. The world around them was a blur of shouting miners and settling dust, but Alara saw only the gray pallor of the man who had taught her how to live.
"Breathe," she commanded, her voice cracking. "You don't get to leave me, Elias Thorne. You promised."
The boy, Leo, crawled through the mud to her side. He didn't speak. He had been silent for so long that words were foreign to him, but he reached out a small, trembling hand and placed it on Elias's chest, right over his heart. He looked at Alara, his eyes wide with the same terrified plea that was screaming in her own mind. Don't let him go. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind whistling through the canyon. No breath, no movement. Alara felt the crushing weight of the universe bearing down on her. The cruel irony of finding her son only to lose her soulmate felt like a final, twisted joke from God. But Elias Thorne was not a man who bowed easily to death. A sudden, jagged gasp tore through him. His body arched off the ground, air rushing into his starving lungs with a wet, rattling sound. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused, staring up at the smoke-choked sky. "Stay with me," Alara sobbed, leaning over him, her tears washing streaks of coal dust from his face. "We are here. We are all here." Elias blinked, the haze slowly clearing. He looked at Alara, then at the small hand resting on his chest. He turned his head slightly and saw the boy. A faint, pained grimace that might have been a smile touched his lips. "The cub," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Did we save the cub?"
"Yes," Alara wept, laughing through her tears. "We saved the cub. Now you have to save yourself."
The recovery was not swift, nor was it easy. The journey back to the high country was a slow, agonizing crawl, but they were not alone. The wilderness, which had once tried to kill Alara, now seemed to shelter them. They made camp in the foothills, where Alara nursed Elias with the same fierce dedication he had once shown her. She cleaned his wounds, hunted for their food, and kept the fire burning through the long, cold nights. And as Elias healed, so did Leo. The boy who had been sold as a mute, broken thing began to find his footing. At first he would only watch, his eyes tracking the fox, Ember, as she darted through the brush. Then he began to mimic Elias. He would pick up a stick and pretend to whittle. He would sit by the fire and stare into the flames, finding the same quiet peace the mountain man cherished. One evening, weeks later, back in the safety of their hidden valley, the silence was finally broken. Elias was sitting by the cave entrance, his arm in a sling, watching the sunset paint the peaks in hues of violet and gold. Leo sat beside him, holding a piece of pine bark. "Is the mountain yours?" the boy asked. His voice was rusty, unused, but clear. Elias looked down at him. He didn't treat the boy like a child. He treated him like a man in the making. "No," Elias said softly. "We belong to the mountain. It keeps us as long as we respect it." Leo nodded solemnly. Then he looked at Alara, who was stirring a stew over the fire, her hand resting absent-mindedly on the swell of her belly, where new life was growing strong. "Is she my mother?" Leo asked. Elias reached out with his good hand and ruffled the boy's hair, a gesture of affection he had never shown anyone before. "She is the strongest woman who ever walked this earth. She fought the world to find you. She is your mother, and this," he gestured to Valley, the cave, and woman, "this is your pack." Months passed. The snow came and went, but the cold never touched them again. The cave, once a place of survival, had become a home. It was filled with the sounds of life, the crackle of the fire, the playful yip of the fox, the laughter of a boy learning to track rabbits in the snow. Alara stood at the edge of the frozen pool one morning, watching Elias teach Leo how to draw a bow. Her heart, once a hollow vessel of grief, was now so full she thought it might burst. She had been cast out, rejected, and sentenced to die. She had been told she was barren, useless, a curse. But as she watched the two men in her life, the one who had saved her, and the one she had saved. She knew the truth. The town of Bitter Creek was the hollow place. They had buildings and laws and civilization, but they had no heart. She looked down at her stomach, feeling the strong kick of the baby that would join them in the spring. A daughter, she felt sure. A sister for Leo. A new life for the new world they had built. Mrs. Sterling was rotting in her empty mansion with her ghosts. Caleb was dust in the ground. But Aara Vance? Alara Vance was the queen of the high country. She walked over to them, wrapping her arms around Elias's waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. He leaned into her touch, solid and warm. Leo looked up at them, his eyes bright with happiness. "Ready for the hunt?" Alara asked. Elias smiled, the expression reaching his eyes. "We are always ready." They turned together, a family forged in fire and ice, and walked into the trees. The wilderness was no longer a threat. It was their kingdom, and they were finally, truly free. And there you have it, folks. The fire in the hearth burns a little brighter tonight, doesn't it? Alara and Elias didn't just survive the winter. They conquered the past. They proved that family isn't about bloodlines or fancy names. It's about who bleeds for you, who fights for you, and who refuses to let go when the mountain comes crashing down. I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Leo will grow up to be a mountain man just like Elias? And what should they name the new baby coming in the spring? Give me your best suggestions down below. I read every single one. If this story of redemption and revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, please give this video a massive thumbs up and share it with a friend who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start over. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a trip back to the Wild West. Until next time, keep your powder dry, watch your back trail, and hug your loved ones tight. This is Frontier Rescue Stories, signing off.